The painting that needed blood to stop screaming. Would you believe it if someone said a painting could scream? Not metaphorically, really scream. Every dawn, in the dark. Helena didn't believe it either. Until I inherited an old painting from a relative everyone called an occultist. She thought it was just a bizarre, ugly, harmless piece of work. But on the first night, something in her changed. The sound started at 2:47, low, high, like a wail coming from inside the frame. And on the third night, the scream was so loud it made the lamps flicker. Nothing helped until the day she bled. And then the painting fell silent, but only for one night. What was happening there was not art. It was a pact that should never have been inherited. If that's already made you uneasy, just imagine what's yet to come. So, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and discover what happens when a work of art demands more than admiration. The news came in a brief, almost dry call from a lawyer from the countryside. Helena Torres! He confirmed the name in a grave voice. Your great-uncle, Augusto Noguera, passed away 3 days ago. You were listed as the sole heir. There is only one item left in your care. Helena barely remembered Augusto. She remembered hearing her parents talk about him in whispers, as if trying to awaken something dormant. A lonely, reclusive man who lived far from the city and his relatives. A spiritualist, an occultist, they said. He had an old house where, according to rumors, he performed rituals and studied things that shouldn't be studied. But there were never any scandals, only silence surrounding his name. Curious and slightly uneasy, Helena traveled to the small town where he had lived for the past 30 years. The house, now empty, smelled of stale incense, mold, and something hard to name. The lawyer led her to the living room where, in the center of the main wall, hung the only heirloom, a painting. It was larger than she expected. About 5 feet tall, with a dark wooden frame carved with symbols that seemed to dance in the dim light. The canvas depicted a hooded figure, shrouded in thick shadows so that the eyes were invisible. The mouth, too, seemed blurred, or perhaps deliberately blurred, as if silenced. The background was an opaque haze, and there was something about the painting that made the eye avert, as if instinct refused to look for long. He left a single verbal instruction, the lawyer said, handing him an envelope containing the documents. He said the painting was to be kept safe, and that it was never to be destroyed. Never. Helena found the emphasis strange. But why? What's so important about that? I don't know, the lawyer replied, already closing the file. I don't even want to know. My work ends here. In the following days, Helena's life became a jumble of uncertainty. The painting had been transported to her apartment in Sao Paulo, carefully wrapped in bubble wrap and protected by a black cloth. She hung it on the living room wall, more out of uncertainty than choice. Its style didn't fit with anything. It was dark, heavy, almost hostile. That first night, as silence spread through the house, Helena spent long minutes simply observing the painting. She didn't know why, but she had the impression that something was trapped inside, something contained. And more than that, she felt the painting noticed her presence, a subtle sensation, as if she were being evaluated, judged. Before falling asleep on pure impulse, she touched the frame with her fingertips. It was cold, like metal under snow. And for a second she thought she heard, deep in the background, something that didn't belong in the world around her. A muffled, deep whisper, like an echo born from within the wood. But when she turned, silence reigned. Helena shook her head, laughed nervously, and went to sleep. Little did she know that, with that simple inheritance, she had brought into her home not just an Antique object, but a living bundle. And hungry. That night, Helena's sleep was light, fragmented. Every small sound in the apartment seemed clearer than usual. The creak of the closet, the creak of the wood, the distant hum of the elevator. It was as if the painting's presence had heightened her senses, or as if her body didn't trust itself enough to rest fully. At 2:47 a.m., she woke with a shudder. There were no dreams, just a restlessness in her chest, as if she'd lost something. She lay there for a few seconds, trying to understand the reason for her awakening, until she heard it. A sound, low, muffled, guttural, like a moan, but not human. It seemed to come from a deep, hollow place, resonating through something solid. Helena sat up in bed, alert. The sound continued, rhythmic, spaced, like the wail of someone trying not to be heard, but unable to contain the pain any longer. He thought about neighbors, plumbing, the old elevator, but nothing matched that sound. It was as if it wasn't coming from anywhere in particular. It was there, in the house. She walked slowly out of the room, her bare feet touching the cold hallway floor. The lamplight in the living room was still on, casting flickering shadows against the walls. And then she realized the closer she got to the living room, the louder the sound grew. It was wings, and more specifically, it was from the painting. Helena stopped a meter from the painting. Her heart raced as she realized the impossible. The sound was coming from inside the frame, from the canvas. The moan was low, but it carried an almost physical density, as if vibrating in the air. The hooded figure in the painting seemed darker, deeper than during the day, and even without visible eyes, she was certain she was being watched. A shiver ran down the back of his neck. She instinctively took 2 steps back. She wanted to run, to leave the house, but her feet felt glued to the ground. Her gaze couldn't tear itself away from the painting. The sound pulled her, not out of curiosity, but out of a shared anguish, as if the noise were triggering some buried memory. Without knowing why, Helena whispered, "What do you want?" The sound stopped for a second. A tense silence fell over the room, like the pause before thunder. And then the noise began again, louder, closer. She stumbled back, her heart pounding. She ran to her room, locked the door, and huddled in bed like a child afraid of the dark. She covered her ears with her hands, trying to shut out the sound, but it was still there, whispering through the walls, penetrating her mind as if searching for a way in. Dawn arrived slowly. With it came silence. When the sun touched the living room windows, the apartment seemed normal again. The sound had disappeared. The painting was quiet, and for a moment Helena wondered if she had dreamed it all. But as he approached the painting again, he noticed a new detail. A thin, almost imperceptible strand of dust was falling from the bottom of the frame, as if something inside the wood had moved. That morning, as she left for work, Helena glanced at the painting one more time before closing the door. For the first time, she didn't just see a hooded figure. She saw a prison and something banging against the invisible bars of time. Helena tried to carry on with her life as normal for the next few days, convincing herself that what she'd heard that morning was a product of exhaustion, imagination, or perhaps the strange aura. The painting carried, but deep down she knew otherwise. What she'd felt upon hearing that sound wasn't imaginary. It was physical. It was real. The second night, the noise returned. At exactly 2:47 a.m., she awoke to the same muffled groan, now a little louder, as if something were gaining confidence or strength. When she rose from bed, a shiver ran down her spine like a gust of icy wind. Each step toward the living room seemed to plunge her into a denser, darker atmosphere, as if the air had grown viscous around the painting's presence. There he was. The hooded figure remained motionless in the painting, but the sensation was that something was stirring within. The sound wasn't a clear voice, but Helena began to discern nuances, a tone of pain, another of anger, a restrained lament. It was as if the thing within the painting wanted to communicate, but the language was broken. Something imprisoned, pressing against the edges of an invisible cell. On the third night, the sound grew. Even louder. This time, the painting seemed to vibrate slightly. The sound grew deeper, more pulsating, and Helena realized that no external sound, not the roar of cars on the street, not the barking of a distant dog, could drown it out. It was as if the sound were within the house itself, but also within her. She tried ignoring it, using headphones, leaving the television on, chanting mantras, anything to drown out the sound. But nothing worked. The moaning pierced the sounds of the physical world. As if it didn't belong there, and most disturbing of all, it always stopped when the sun rose, without fail, as if the presence of light had the power to momentarily silence the pain. On the fourth night, she tried covering the painting with a thick sheet. It worked for a few hours, but at exactly 2:47 a.m., the sound broke through the fabric like a thunderclap held in check for too long. The sheet vibrated, shifted on its own, and fell to the floor without explanation. Helena watched, paralyzed, her heart in her throat. The sound was now accompanied by a faint wooden creak, as if the frame were cracking from within. She started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help. Artificial light didn't have the same power as sunlight. Deep down, she felt the painting knew this. The following nights became torturous. With each new cycle, the sound became more demanding, as if demanding attention, as if crying out for release. At times, Helena swore she could hear sentences forming. Between the moans, incomplete words, slurred sounds that seemed to come from a wounded throat, words like "it hurts," "come back," "why?" One of those nights, overcome by fear and curiosity, she approached the painting with her phone in hand, ready to record. But as soon as she pressed the record button, the sound stopped. The phone screen went dark, and for a second, she saw her own image reflected in the glass of the frame. But with her eyes dimmed, like the hooded figure, she screamed. She almost dropped her phone. From that moment on, she noticed a pattern. The sound wasn't random. It seemed conditioned. It always started at the same time, and the more she tried to ignore it, the louder it became. It was like a wail demanding attention, as if its pain depended on her presence. And with this realization, a thought began to slowly form within Helena. If that sound was growing, night after night, what would happen when he became loud enough to be heard by everyone? Helena tried to carry on with her life as normal for the next few days, convincing herself that what she'd heard that morning was a product of exhaustion, imagination, or perhaps the strange aura the painting carried. But deep down, she knew otherwise. What she'd felt upon hearing that sound wasn't imaginary. It was physical. It was real. The second night, the noise returned. At exactly 2:47 a.m., she awoke to the same muffled groan, now a little louder, as if something were gaining confidence or strength. When she rose from bed, a shiver ran down her spine like a gust of icy wind. Each step toward the living room seemed to plunge her into a denser, darker atmosphere, as if the air had grown viscous around the painting's presence. There he was. The hooded figure remained motionless in the painting, but the sensation was that something was stirring within. The sound wasn't a clear voice, but Helena began to discern nuances. A tone of pain, another of anger, a restrained lament. It was as if the thing within the painting wanted to communicate, but the language was broken. Something imprisoned, pressing against the edges of an invisible cell. On the third night, the sound grew even louder. This time, the painting seemed to vibrate slightly. The sound grew deeper, more pulsating, and Helena realized that no external sound, not the roar of cars on the street, not the barking of a distant dog, could drown it out. It was as if the sound were within the house itself, but also within her. She tried ignoring it, using headphones, leaving the television on, chanting mantras, anything to drown out the sound. But nothing worked. The moaning pierced the sounds of the physical world, as if it didn't belong there. And most disturbing of all, it always stopped when the sun rose, without fail, as if the presence of light had the power to momentarily silence the pain. On the fourth night, she tried covering the painting with a thick sheet. It worked for a few hours. But at exactly 2:47 a.m., the sound broke through the fabric like a thunderclap held in check for too long. The sheet vibrated, shifted on its own, and fell to the floor without explanation. Helena watched, paralyzed, her heart in her throat. The sound was now accompanied by a faint wooden creak, as if the frame were cracking from within. She started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help. Artificial light didn't have the same power as sunlight. Deep down, she felt the painting knew this. The following nights became torturous. With each new cycle, the sound became more demanding, as if demanding attention, as if crying out for release. At times, Helena swore she could hear sentences forming between the moans. Incomplete words, slurred sounds that seemed to come from a wounded throat. Words like, "It hurts," "Come back," "Why?" One of those nights, overcome by fear and curiosity, she approached the painting with her phone in hand, ready to record. But as soon as she pressed the record button, the sound stopped. The phone screen went dark, and for a second, she saw her own image reflected in the glass of the frame, but with her eyes dimmed, like the hooded figure. She screamed. She almost dropped her phone. From that moment on, she noticed a pattern. The sound wasn't random. It seemed conditioned. It always started at the same time, and the more she tried to ignore it, the louder it became. It was like a wail demanding attention, as if its pain depended on her presence. And with this realization, a thought began to slowly form within Helena. If that sound was growing, night after night, what would happen when he became loud enough to be heard by everyone? Helena spent the next day in a state of suspension. The absolute silence of the previous night still echoed within her like something impossible to forget. A terrifying relief that made it all too clear. The sound had not ceased by chance. Something had been satisfied, and that something now knew how to silence the pain. For hours, she tried to rationalize. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the cut had distracted her mind. Maybe the sound, for some inexplicable reason, was becoming more sporadic. But deep down, she knew the blood had been the key, and the painting had accepted the offering. As night fell again, Helena armed herself with bandages, scissors, tissues, and even a small kitchen knife. The idea of repeating the act was absurd, but the fear of hearing that sound again outweighed any revulsion. She sat on the sofa and stared at the clock. When the digital numbers reached 2:47, she stopped breathing for a second. The sound returned, just as it had been the nights before, but slightly more subdued. It was as if it were testing her patience, waiting. The noise remained low, laced with an almost physical ache, vibrating in the air like a frequency only she could hear. Then, with a trembling hand, Helena took the blade. A small cut on the tip of her finger, a drop, two. She approached the painting and let the blood drip onto the frame, just as it had the night before. The sound stopped immediately. Silence returned. She nearly fell to the ground with relief. Fear was turning into a new emotion, understanding. A pact had been made, not out of will, but out of necessity. The next morning, Helena noticed another detail. The wood in the frame was a little less opaque, as if it had absorbed moisture. The carvings seemed clearer, and the figure in the painting, still hooded and shrouded in shadow, was more present. As if the previously blurred contours were beginning to gain definition. Over the next few days, Helena confirmed the pattern. Every night at 2:47 a.m., the sound began. And it always stopped with a new drop of blood. A tiny incision was enough, a small trickle running from the tip of her finger. She began keeping gauze, alcohol, and adhesive tape by the couch as part of her routine. Gradually, the physical pain was replaced by something more subtle, the feeling of being watched. Even during the day, I felt the hooded figure's gaze whenever I passed the room. At random moments, a chill crept up my spine, even with all the windows closed. One cloudy late afternoon, I thought I heard a creaking sound coming from the frame, like wood expanding or breathing. She tried other alternatives, drops of blood from raw meat. Nothing. Blood from a needle prick on cotton. Nothing. It had to be hers, always directly from her, trying to understand what was behind that. Silent hunger. Helena began rummaging through her great-uncle's belongings stored in boxes in the storage room. She found old books, notebooks with jumbled notes, unsent letters and a diary, leather-bound, with yellowed pages covered in symbols. In the first pages, she read notes on spiritual containment practices, pain transference, and vital fluid sealing. It all seemed very theoretical until she saw a passage highlighted in red pencil. Pain that doesn't die screams, and only living blood can anesthetize it. Helena closed the diary with trembling hands. At that moment, he understood that this was no ordinary painting. It was a prison, and the key to the cell was made from the body of the person who owned it. With her great-uncle's diary in hand, Helena plunged into sleepless nights of reading. The notes, chaotic and laden with esoteric symbols, seemed written by someone on the brink of madness or revelation. Amidst the nervous scribbles, drawings of distorted human figures, and circles with inscriptions in Latin and archaic Hebrew, fragments of a hidden past emerged, linking the painting to an ancient practice. The diary spoke of something called transfer of pain, the transference of pain. According to the record, certain ancient cultures believed that extreme pain, when not accompanied by justice, did not disappear with death. It remained suspended. Profound suffering could cling to the material world like a spiritual anchor. To prevent this torment from contaminating the living, rituals were performed to seal it in physical objects, urns, mirrors, sculptures, or paintings. Helena rummaged through more boxes and found a manila envelope marked with the symbol of a serpent entwined with a cross, the same one discreetly carved into the painting's frame. Inside was a yellowed letter dated 1912, signed by someone named Rafael Nogueira, likely an ancestor. The letter read, "The painting must be fed only with voluntary blood. The entity must never touch flesh or be exposed to fire. The pain that inhabits this prison is older than our words, and if it is released without the ritual being completed, there will be no containment." Helena shuddered as she read this. With each new page of the diary, The truth unfolded. Her great-uncle wasn't the painting's creator. He was its guardian. From a young age, he had been chosen to continue the work of his predecessors, keeping the entity imprisoned. His role was simple yet vital, to keep the pact alive. But something went wrong. In the diary's final chapters, the words became more urgent, more tremulous. He reported that the final sealing ritual required a complete sacrifice, not just the blood, but the soul of the one who wished to seal the prison forever. Augustus had written, "I lacked courage, I lack faith or perhaps humanity. Every time I feed the prison with my blood, I feel it knows me better and wants me whole. If I fail, the next heir will know what to do. May he forgive me. May he survive." Helena put down the diary, her eyes welling up. This wasn't just a burden, it was an inherited sentence. She stood, walked over to the painting, and stared at it. For the first time, he noticed tiny cracks along the sides of the painting, as if the structure were under stress. The wood breathed, and the hooded figure seemed clearer. His mind then reconnected all the events, the exact time the sound appeared, the silence that only came with his blood, the feeling of being watched, the dreams in which the painting called her. She understood now. The imprisoned entity wasn't just a shadow, it was condensed pain, kept alive by a pact that fed on human sacrifice. And this pact was renewed every time she bled, not as punishment, but as payment, a rent for the imprisonment of that presence. From that night on, Helena's perception changed. She wasn't just a victim of a cursed object. She was part of an ancient cycle, shaped by fear and the need to contain something that could not be destroyed. But what disturbed her most was the last sentence written in handwritten, almost illegible handwriting at the end of the diary. The painting doesn't just want blood. He wants to remember. He wants to be remembered. And when he is strong enough, he will tell what they did to him. Helena closed the diary with a sharp snap. The painting's story wasn't just about what he did. It was about what had been done, and the bill was far from being paid. Helena's nights became mechanical, like a bitter ritual she no longer discussed with herself. At 2:47 a.m., the entity's pain pulsed through the house like a macabre clock, and she, resigned, made a small cut, let the blood drip onto the frame, and waited for silence. It was a wordless agreement, a cycle that exhausted her more with each dawn. But what was once merely physical began to cross the boundaries of reality. The first signs came in the form of nightmares. At first, brief flashes, dark corridors, half open. Doors, eyes extinguished in the darkness. Then, entire scenes. Helena found herself inside a ruined church, pursued by shadows that whispered her name in voices that seemed multiple and distorted. On the altar, always the painting, hung over invisible corpses, bleeding from within. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her throat dry and her ears throbbing, as if the sound of the nightmare had echoed in her flesh. Throughout the day, the symptoms persisted. He began to feel a constant pressure behind his eyes, as if something were forcing him inside. He felt dizzy as he walked through the room. At one point, as he turned his head, he saw the hooded figure move slightly to the side. There was no wind, no cracks, but the painting had changed. She blinked several times, her heart pounding in her throat. The figure stood in the same place as always, motionless, but the feeling remained. The painting was more alive than before. Over the next few weeks, Helena noticed she was losing weight. Even though she was eating normally, her eyes, always vivid, began to have deep, dark circles. Her skin seemed colder, and the fatigue was so intense that it became difficult to distinguish between waking and dreaming. In one of them, She saw herself standing in front of the mirror, but the reflection didn't cut her finger. The reflection smiled. One morning, she woke to find her pillow stained with blood. A small cut on her left hand indicated that she had unwittingly fed the painting in her sleep. This terrified her more than any nighttime lament. The pact was no longer under her control. She was feeding on her own accord, and more. That afternoon, with the sun still high, she crossed the room and felt a sharp chill, as if someone had breathed on the back of her neck. She looked around. Nothing, but when she turned to the painting, she saw it. The hooded figure was no longer completely still. It wasn't a physical movement. It was something in the painting, in the shadows. A subtle shift in the angle of the head. The figure now seemed slightly tilted, as if watching her. The final straw came when Helena tried to leave the house to spend the night at a friend's house. She needed to escape, to breathe. But as she locked the door and took 3 steps into the building's hallway, a feeling of dizziness overcame her so strongly that she fell to her knees. A buzzing sound filled her ears. The sound of the painting, outside the house, inside her. She staggered back. Sweating, trembling, as she stepped back into the room, the sound instantly ceased. She understood then what the entity was doing. It was expanding, connecting, taking her. Over the next few days, he lost track of time. He couldn't remember if he'd eaten, slept, or spoken to anyone. The apartment grew increasingly dark, as if natural light were refusing to enter. The walls creaked at random moments, and the sound, though it didn't officially begin until 2:47 a.m., could be heard ever so faintly. Throughout the day, a breath, a sigh, and more terrible than all this was what began to emerge at the edge of Helena's thoughts. The feeling that part of herself was being pulled into the frame, not just the blood, but something deeper, as if, night after night, she was becoming part of the frame. Helena's lucidity was crumbling. The boundaries between dream and wakefulness, between inside and outside, between painting and flesh, were beginning to dissolve. She no longer knew how many days it had been since she'd left the house. Her appearance reflected the wear and tear: sunken eyes, grey skin, hands marked by small healed cuts that told of the frequency of the sacrifice. Even so, something inside her resisted, a stubborn impulse that compelled her to keep searching, reading, connecting the dots her great-uncle had left, scattered like pieces of a sinister puzzle. It was rummaging through a secret compartment hidden behind an antique bookshelf, almost by instinct, that she found what would change everything: a hardcover notebook unlike any other. It was no ordinary diary, but a grimoire. The pages were thick, covered in symbols that seemed to move in the candlelight. In the upper corner of several sheets, the same drawing: a hooded figure in a posture of agony, surrounded by concentric circles and words in ancient Latin. The first translation she managed was enough to make her tremble. The soul trapped by pain needs silence. Silence can only be bought with fresh blood. But there is another way: the ritual of closure. Helena devoured the pages. The grimoire detailed what her great-uncle never had the courage to complete: the absolute sealing ritual. An elaborate, 3-step process that required not only blood, but also the surrender of memory, affection, and, ultimately, identity. She understood, with growing nausea, what had been happening since the first night. Each drop of blood wasn't just a physical offering. It was a fragment of herself, the entity. Rather than being held captive, was slowly growing stronger with these incomplete offerings. The pain the painting held was nourishing itself on Helena's humanity. Augustus had tried to end the cycle, but failed. In the grimoire, there was a note he had written in shaky handwriting. "I can't go on. The third step requires the name, my name, and to give it away is to lose the anchor. If the name is given, the seal closes, but whoever seals it doesn't return." That was the price. To seal the entity permanently meant sacrificing one's own soul, handing it over as a living seal. The absence of a complete executor kept the structure in an unstable state, neither fully sealed nor fully liberated. A cycle of contained suffering that demanded daily doses of life. Helena fell to her knees. She wept, trembling. For the first time, she understood the full horror of what she had inherited. The painting was not just a receptacle of pain, but a deep well, thirsting for human presence, for soul, for permanence. And she was now its imperfect guardian, as her great-uncle had been before. The sound, the exhaustion, the dreams, the changes in the painting. It was all part of the connection process. The entity didn't want to escape by force. It wanted to convince her, seduce her, become a part of her, until Helena herself chose to open the final door. And time was running out. In recent days, the picture frame had seemed alive. The wood pulsed as if with veins. The carvings had subtly changed shape. Now they formed letters, almost illegible but familiar. One of them was Helena's initial. She understood. The entity already knew part of its name. Only the last word was missing, and the pact would then be complete, but not in the way his great-uncle had wished. Helena closed the grimoire with trembling hands. She knew there were 3 paths before her. Keep feeding the picture until there is nothing left of you. Run away and risk someone unaware reactivating the ancestral pain. Or seal with the name, with the sacrifice, but the decision needed to be made soon. Because last night at 2:47 a.m., the sound didn't come as usual, came before. It came with a voice, and he said, "Hel-na." That morning, after the entity uttered her name for the first time, Helena could no longer move naturally. Each gesture seemed to weigh a ton. She stared at the painting as if staring into an abyss that suddenly began to stare back. Something had changed. The tenuous division between outside and inside had been overcome. Now, the painting knew. During the day, she did what she'd been avoiding for days. She sought help. She called old acquaintances of her great-uncle, people she'd only heard about from notebooks and letters. Most refused to talk. One man answered, murmured, "Were you chosen too?" and then hung up. Alone again, Helena did the only thing she could still do: think. And, most importantly, decide. He sat before the painting, now covered by a sheet, trying not to stare directly at the figure, which seemed to shift position with each new glance. He took out a notebook and wrote down what he knew, as if trying to organize the horror might lessen it. 1. Burn the painting, the most impulsive idea. Set fire to everything and destroy the prison. But the records were clear. If the entity were released without the final ritual, it would not disappear. It would be released into the physical world, an ancestral spirit shaped by centuries of pain, hunger, and injustice. A being that has screamed for over a century, now knowing the name of the new guardian. It would be a sentence not only for it, but for all who crossed its path. 2. Run away. Another possibility: sell the apartment, disappear, vanish. But the last few weeks showed that the entity had formed a bond. The sound followed her. The cuts appeared even in her sleep. Her name was already part of the picture, and escaping could mean transferring the suffering to someone unprepared. As Augusto had predicted the prison needs a guardian until the ritual is completed. 3. Face it. The last option, the darkest path. Perform the full sealing ritual. 3 steps, 3 renunciations. The surrender of personal pain through the voluntary reopening of a deep wound, physical or emotional. The giving of affection, represented by a sacrifice linked to love, something or someone that carries real meaning. The surrender of the name, which would seal the spirit and erase the executioner's existence from history. A complete disappearance, not death, but oblivion. Helena stared at the grimoire open before her. The instructions were clear, but the consequence was erasure. She would cease to exist in the world's memory. No friends would remember her, no photos would survive, no digital, physical, or emotional trace. She took a deep breath. She was exhausted, she was scared, but she also had a nagging feeling that if she didn't do this, someone else would have to, and maybe that person wouldn't have time to decide. That night she prepared the space as described, protective seals, a circle of coarse salt, white and black candles, a bowl for the blood, a printed image of her mother's face, who had died 10 years earlier, the affection she held most dearly. At 2:44 a.m., it started to hurt. Even before any cuts were made, the entire body reacted. The painting, still covered, pulsed in the darkness. The shadows moved even with the static candles. At 2:47, she uttered her first word, then the second. And then he made the cut. The blood fell. The portrait shuddered. The room became cold as a tomb. She wept as she burned her mother's photo, each tear feeling like glass in her chest. Finally, she knelt before the picture and, with a broken voice, spoke her full name 3 times. Nothing happened for a few seconds. Then a dull scream exploded in the air. The painting split in half, but without revealing its bottom, it just disappeared, as if sucked dry. The frame crumbled to dust. The candles went out on their own, and then silence. The most absolute, complete, strange silence. Helena stood there, alone for a few minutes, or maybe hours. But the next day, neighbors commented that the apartment was empty. No sign of anyone living there, no furniture, no clothes, no documents, no record of who lived there. No one remembered her name. It was as if she had never existed. Months later, Helena's apartment was officially put up for sale. There was no inventory, no heirs. The documents were inconsistent, as if the last resident's name had never existed in the system. Neither neighbors nor acquaintances could describe her clearly. A quiet girl, they said. She had sad eyes, but no one knew her name. There wasn't even a photo. It was like trying to remember a forgotten dream upon waking. The real estate agent cleaned the place thoroughly. The apartment seemed ordinary. 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, a spacious living room, nothing unusual. No signs of violence, no signs of electrical leaks, no strange smells, except perhaps for an unexplained sensation of cold air on one of the living room walls. The only item left behind was a covered cardboard box, apparently forgotten in the laundry room's overhead closet. Inside, carefully wrapped in dark velvet cloths and bubble wrap, was the painting, or rather, what looked like a painting. Now, without a frame, the canvas had stiffened like wood. The hooded figure was there, but different. The background, which had previously been an opaque haze, now had shapes, as if under construction. Instead of just shadows, there were subtle traces of a ruined landscape. The position of the entity's head seemed tilted, as if it were resting. The dull eyes still lacked a glow, but the feeling that something slept there was undeniable. The unsuspecting real estate agent tossed the box among other antiques for donation. Without any identification, the painting ended up in a local antique shop, where it remained for weeks, leaning against a cold wall and ignored by customers, until a man noticed him. He was a collector of exotic artifacts, newly arrived in town. His name was Marcos. He saw the painting, touched the edge, and commented to the seller, "It has a strange presence. It seems incomplete, but alive." He bought it without bargaining, paid cash, and took it home wrapped in cloths. In his new apartment, a spacious, minimalist penthouse, Marcos hung the painting on the main wall of the living room. The piece clashed with the rest of the decor, but that made it even more interesting to him. "True art is the kind that disturbs," he said aloud, toasting himself with a glass of wine. That first night he woke to a noise, faint, low. The clock beside the bed flashed 2:47. Sitting up in bed, confused, he thought it was plumbing, but the sound seemed to be inside the walls. He got up, walked to the hallway, and felt a chill as he passed through the room. The painting in the dim moonlight seemed darker, and the sound came from there. He came closer, and curious, he placed his hand on the edge of the screen. "Interesting," he murmured, without knowing why. The sound stopped. For a few seconds, then it started again, stronger, more continuous. Marcos felt a sting in his hand, a small scratch, perhaps from the tip of a splinter. Blood trickled down the side of his finger slowly and fell. A single drop touched the screen. Silence. He smiled. Intrigued. What material is this? Does it react to touch? He turned to go to sleep, figuring he would find out later. But behind him, the painting now showed something else. Not just the hooded figure, but a new outline, still blurred, still emerging. A woman's face, incomplete, as if being remembered. And at 2:47 the next morning, the sound came back, higher, more demanding, because the prison was sealed, yes, but sealed with a name, with pain, and with a soul. And what now rested within? The painting was no longer just an entity of ancestral suffering. It was also Helena, and now she had learned to scream.